Hello, my name is Tammy French. Today I'm talking out of the textbook, The Art of Public Speaking by Stephen Lucas, and we're looking at Chapter 8, which is Supporting Your Ideas. If you would like to watch this entire presentation with closed captioning, please visit the Communicate submenu on the UWW-TV website at uwwtv.org. So, you found your sources for your speech. You found exactly what you want, which is great. That's only the first step. The next step is deciding within those sources what you're going to pull out. So remember that your sources are things like the books you find, or the scholarly article, or maybe the newspaper article, or the interview you do. Those are your sources. But the things you pull out of your sources are called your supporting materials. Now, there's different kinds of supporting materials. Your textbook actually goes into detail about a lot of different kinds. Today, I'm just going to focus on 3 of them, though, the 3 most common, and those are examples and statistics and testimony. So let's start by talking about examples. Examples are so common. We use examples a lot, I think sometimes without even thinking about it. And we like examples. I know personally, they really help me when I have a hard time understanding exactly what someone's getting at. They provide a level of concreteness to an otherwise abstract idea. If we're talking about something that's a little less tangible, examples can be really helpful. So for example, I'm using an example of an example, I realize. But if I were to say to you that I want you to be a successful COM 110 student, what does that mean to you? Well, that word success, that can be measured in different ways. So I would want to give examples. I would want to say to you, I want you to be more confident when you speak. I would say to you, I want you to learn how to have an organized speech. And those to me are what I mean by success. Well, you might be thinking to yourself, well, to me, success in COM 110 means getting an A. And that's okay, but you can see how the examples help to bring out that we have different meanings of that word, right? Now, even though examples are very common, there's different types of examples that we're going to cover. First of all, a brief example, and that is what it just sounds like. It's when you can just say the name of something and your audience instantly knows what you're talking about. So if I'm talking about college mascots and I say Willie Warhawk, well, we know exactly what that means. If I'm talking about fantastic NFL quarterbacks and I say Patrick Mahomes, well, no more needs to be said. So sometimes just a word or a place can be mentioned. If I say iconic feats of architecture like the Eiffel Tower, everyone knows what that is. So I don't need to explain. I don't need to go into any more detail. A brief example will suffice. Now, another kind of example is an extended example. And this label makes sense, right? It's when we're taking an example and pulling it apart. But a much more common way that we think of extended examples is as a story. We like to think of ourselves including a story or an anecdote within our speech. I love it when students include these in their speeches because it helps to make the speech a lot more connected to the student. So, for example, let's pretend that your informative speech is about a vacation destination that you took. And you're going to say, there are 3 things a person should know about Aruba. And those 3 things are the food, the landscape, and the recreational activities. And as you're talking about the food, you tell a story about a restaurant that you went to when you were on vacation with your parents and some of the crazy food you tried there and some of the interesting experiences you had there. That helps your speech a lot. That kind of a story being inserted in your speech can really make it a lot more interesting. So extended examples, I'm a big fan of. And then lastly, we have hypothetical examples. So sometimes we haven't experienced something. We don't know what it is. So we say to the audience, imagine if this happened. That's an extended example. If my speech is about hybrid cars and the future of the automobile industry, I mean, we've got cars that don't run on gas anymore. What about flying cars? Imagine if you're driving down the road and your car actually has no tires. Your car is sitting about a foot above the ground, whisking down the road. Those are hypothetical examples, and they're particularly useful, again, if we're doing something, maybe something futuristic or just something that we can't really imagine being in. Now, when it comes to examples, there's some really great reasons to use them. First of all, they can do a great job of reinforcing your ideas and clarifying your ideas. As I was saying before, sometimes if we're talking about something that's intangible, using something a little more concrete can really help people understand. If I say, I want there to be peace on our campus, well, give me some examples of what you're talking about, right? They can really personalize the ideas. As when I used the example of a vacation place, they can help make your speech seem more personal, and audiences really like that. They like to see you, the speaker, come through within a speech. And so by you being able to connect your speech to yourself because of the experiences you've had with the topic and some of the different things that you've gone through, that can be at a really nice touch. And then examples can also make your speech just feel a lot more alive, a lot more rich, a lot more vivid. You know, let's be honest. Sometimes even the very best speeches have a main point or two that are a little dry. And so if we can have an interesting example embedded within there, it can really liven things up a lot. So examples are one type of supporting material. And again, I'm a big fan of using examples all throughout your speech to help explain exactly what you're talking about. But another kind of supporting material that's extremely common for us to use is statistics. Boy, we are a culture that loves statistics. We love our numbers. We know that numbers are a way of kind of summing things up. They're a way of explaining a situation, but very briefly. Statistics can do that for us. And whether we're talking about percentages or fractions or numbers in some other way, statistics can be really, really useful. But I urge you to be cautious with your statistics. And we'll talk about a few tips for using them. First of all, make sure you are using statistics sparingly. I think of statistics sometimes like when you're adding salt to a recipe. Sometimes you want just a little bit of salt sprinkled in there. It can add great flavor. But boy, too much salt can very quickly ruin a recipe. And the same thing is true with statistics. A few statistics smattered around in your speech can be really helpful. And those numbers can sometimes be very powerful. But if you overdo it, you're going to overwhelm the audience. First of all, those initial powerful numbers, well, they're going to seem kind of watered down. They're going to lose their power if you use a whole bunch of numbers. Secondly, I know for me, if I've got a lot of numbers coming at me, wow, I kind of start to glaze over a little bit because I start to misunderstand what those numbers are representing. So use them sparingly. You go ahead and use them because they can be fantastic and powerful, but don't use them too often. Make sure you explain the sources that the statistics came from. Now, this is true for all of our supporting material. We want to make sure to identify our sources, but it is especially true with statistics. I don't know if you're like me, but I tend to be a little skeptical sometimes. And if someone runs at me and tells me some kind of a statistic that I find hard to believe, you know, Tammy, I just heard that, 36% of freshmen eat ham sandwiches for lunch. One of the first things I'm going to say is, what? Where did you hear that? And we say that to our friends in conversation, don't we? Where did you get that from? Because we are questioning their sources. And that's what we tend to do with statistics especially. We question them. So it's particularly important that you cite your sources there. I'll give you another little insider tip too. As your speech teacher, If I hear a statistic, it's a little bit of a red flag waving in the air that I better hear a source coming pretty quick, because it's a very, very easy place that I know the student is going to need to have an additional kind of citation. So just make sure you're really doing that. Make sure you explain your statistics thoroughly and interpret them. What I mean by that is, sometimes if you have a number all by itself, it's kind of like, okay, fine, thank you for sharing that. But it doesn't have a lot of meaning until you take the extra steps and explain what it is. So if we know that 36% of freshmen on our campus are eating ham sandwiches for lunch, this means that the deli turkey industry, the deli roast beef industry, and the deli whatever bologna industry, they're probably losing some money. And so we maybe shouldn't buy as much of those kinds of meat products if ham is the really popular one. We're going to need to buy more ham, and et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes if we explain the statistics and explain their implications, explain the power of them, then our audience will understand a little bit better. And then lastly, make sure that you consider using a visual aid if needed. Visual aids, when it comes to statistics, can be really helpful because we can make a chart or a graph or something that can really help make more sense of it. A lot of us are visual learners. And so if you show me something visual to help me understand and digest those numbers, I'm probably going to get it a lot more. If you say to me, back in 1970, this was true, and in 1980, this was true, and in 1990, and 2000, again, that's going to be a lot to take in. But if you just show me a line graph, and I can see the line graph going up and down, well, now it's making a lot more sense, and it's making sense a lot quicker. So consider using a visual aid for your statistics. The last type of supporting material I want to go over with you today is testimony. Now, testimony is simply when we bring other people's ideas into our speech with us. You know, testimony can be great because it's our voice, but now we've got another voice along with ours in our speech, and that can really make our speech more credible for the audience. So as we talk about testimony, first of all, we're going to talk about two different kinds of testimony, but then I want to share with you two different formats that testimony can be in. So first of all, we have expert testimony. And this is perhaps the kind of testimony that you commonly think of when you get someone that's an expert in their field or in their discipline or at that skill, when you get them to say to reinforce your ideas. Expert testimony can be a fantastic form of supporting material because if you've got your idea here and now you've got this expert that is saying the same thing, well, boy, now you look smart. So expert testimony can be terrific. We talked in an earlier lecture about how our campus is fantastically filled with experts, professors in all these various fields that can hopefully really be useful to you in your speeches if you do an interview with them or send and exchange some emails. Certainly their expert testimony within your speech could really add an exciting layer. The other kind of testimony, though, is called peer testimony. Peer testimony is the idea that just sort of the average person, just like you and I, they had maybe an unusual experience, or they found themselves in a position that was a little unique that made them worthy of sharing what happened to them. Now, peer testimony isn't always necessarily critical or important to a speech, but it can be. So let me give you a quick example. Gosh, this was years ago. I'm going to take a guess and say it was like 6 or 7 years ago. We had a snowstorm in Wisconsin, big surprise. But the snowstorm came up on us and caught us by surprise. It was very unexpected. The meteorologists didn't predict it or anything like that. And as I recall, it happened at rush hour, so right between like 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the evening. And the Highway 94, Interstate 94, that runs between Madison and Milwaukee, most of you know it. It's a pretty heavily traveled highway. There was, as happens in snowstorms, there was an accident. And as I recall, the initial accident wasn't too big of a deal. But then, of course, you know, visibility was affected by the snow. And so there were other subsequent accidents. And then pretty soon you found that people were just at a standstill on this freeway. The snow kept coming down heavy and coming down fast. And so it was really just this huge log jam that was miles long. So the initial people were sitting there with cars that were damaged. And then you had just regular people that weren't in an accident of any kind, but they couldn't move. And the problem was, because of the snow and because of everything going on, the paramedics and the police and the snowplow drivers, they couldn't get where they needed to go. And of course, certainly the other people couldn't get either. So I remember sitting and watching the news that evening as I was nice and warm in my home, just watching the evening news, watching that and the later news. And they, of course, once it was all cleaned up, and if my memory serves me correct, thankfully no one was badly injured or anything like that. But they interviewed then, of course, the EMTs and some of the snowplow drivers and said, how was it and how did that go? And they gave their status report. But then I found equally as interesting when they interviewed a few of the regular folks, the folks just like you and I that were just stuck. And they said, like, what did you do for heat? Did you turn your car off and turn it back on? How did you try to conserve gasoline? Were you hungry? Just asking them all of those kinds of questions. And I found some of their responses really, really interesting. So peer testimony can actually be a really, really interesting part to add to your speech, depending on what your topic is, because we can relate to average people. Maybe we can't always relate to some of the experts, but we can relate to the average person. Now, if you've decided to use testimony, there's one other thing you can decide. You can decide what to do with it. Very, very commonly, people will just directly quote their interviewee. So they will take their words word for word, using quotation marks, of course, and insert them into your speech. And that's fine. There's no problem with that. But just like with statistics, we do want to use direct quotes sparingly. The problem can be that if I have my speech and for each of my 3 main points, I have nothing but direct quotes within all of those, the speech doesn't quite sound as much like my speech anymore. Now it sounds more like a speech based on the person I interviewed or the person that I took my quotes from. So we want to use direct quotes, they're fine, but just be careful not to use them too often. Because the other alternative we have is to paraphrase. Sometimes you can take whatever that person said and put it into your own words. You're preserving the idea, but you're putting it in your own words. And in order to do this, or what makes this really useful, is having a mix of these two things. Having some direct quotes, but then having some paraphrases as well. It makes the listening of the speech that much more pleasurable. So I urge you to do both of those things. Now, in terms of some tips and some suggestions for using testimony effectively, please make sure that you're quoting and paraphrasing accurately. Sadly, we see quite often, in politics especially, where people take just a little bit of chunk of what someone said, and they take it completely out of context, and they say, look what was said, look over here. And it's unethical to do that. We've talked about ethics in a previous chapter. We want to make sure we're being very accurate and fair with whatever words we're taking from someone else. We want to make sure that we are explaining why the sources are credible. And what I like to call this is qualifying. We want to qualify our sources. So we want to explain why. Why are you using this person? Well, so-and-so is a biology professor from UW-Whitewater. So-and-so found themselves stuck in a snowstorm behind a semi, or whatever it might be. Explain what is their qualification for them being part of your speech. And then lastly, be careful to use qualified and unbiased sources. You know, if the sources that you've chosen have a really obvious lean towards one side, they are really against something, or they're really for something else, sometimes it can make your entire speech seem like it's just a big persuasive attempt. And in our informative speech, we really want to be careful about that. We want to make sure our speech is coming across as very objective. So with that, we've talked about examples and statistics and testimony. I want to share an example of all of these things. So I found an article. Now, my article is from the Washington Post, and I realized that a newspaper article is not the same as a speech outline. Of course, it's not the same. But the way we use supporting material within our speech outline is actually very similar. So I want to look at a couple things within this article. So the article is called Dog Adoptions and Sales Soar During the Pandemic. Hopefully you've heard about this. This is, I guess, one of the silver linings of our quarantining and pandemicking is that there's not as many pets that are in shelters anymore, which of course is wonderful. So I want to look this over and try to highlight, and maybe you can follow along and try to pick out where some of these kinds of supporting material are being used. So looking at this first page, this first article, as we glance down, And I, of course, should attribute my source right off the bat. This is by Kim Cavan, and it was written on August 12th of 2020. But in the very first paragraph of this, we see the Cabbage Patch Kids craze of 1985, the Tickle Me Elmo mania of 1996. To understand what's been happening with the sales and adoptions of real puppies, yada, yada, yada. What are those first two items? They are examples, aren't they? Now, I realize many of you are too young to remember the Cabbage Patch craze or the Tickle Me Elmo craze, but the author is working hard to show that sometimes our whole country goes a little crazy for something, and your author is comparing this puppy craze to some of these other trends that happened earlier in our history. So those examples are right there, and they're brief examples. Because again, although some of you might be a little young for that, there's plenty of us old folks that remember exactly what those were all about. Now, the second paragraph on that same page starts out, within my circle of friends, there are at least 5 people who have gotten a puppy, says Tess Kyrakavikas, a school teacher from Springfield, Virginia, whose boxer puppy Coda joined her family on May 28th. What kind of supporting material is that? Well, hopefully you picked up that that's peer testimony. So this woman named Tess, and her last name I'm sure I butchered, but she's more or less just like you and I, except she just adopted a puppy. So she's not an expert from a vet. She's not some kind of a, shelter administrator or something. No, she's just like you and I. So this is a great example of peer testimony. And of course, you picked up, I'm sure, that this is a direct quote that was highlighted here. So moving on to the second page of this article, the very first paragraph, at the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Los Angeles, a nonprofit shelter, adoptions were double their usual rate in late June, with 10 or 13 adoptions a day. Well, statistic, right? Those numbers jump right out at us. They're comparing what numbers typically are to what numbers are now. So that's an obvious one. And then a couple paragraphs down, we've got another statistic. On the other side of the country, at animal care centers of New York City, 25% of the people who agreed to take in foster dogs temporarily at the start of the pandemic have adopted them permanently in late June. So again, this time it's using a percentage, but it's another statistic. It sums up the status of where things are with those foster animals very quickly. So moving on to the third page of the article, at the very top, they start to use some other kind of supporting material. Starting kind of partway into the paragraph, Hank Grossenbecker, a breeder of Pembroke Welsh Corgis who owns the Heartland Sales Auction in Cabool, Missouri, where commercially licensed breeders, etc., I won't read the whole thing. What is this? Well, this now is expert testimony, because this person is a breeder. So this person has specialty knowledge when it comes to this topic of dogs and adoptions and so on and so forth. Now the rest of that paragraph there is a paraphrase. As you notice, there's no quotation marks, but the author is taking Hank's words and explaining and interpreting what he was saying. But in the next line, we see, that means everyone thinks this boom will go on at least another 60 to 90 days, Grossenbecker says. For most breeders, business is the best it's ever been. And so that's the same source, the same person, Hank Grossenbecker, but now it's a direct quote. And these two paragraphs together, you can see, make a really nice blend of paraphrase plus that direct quote. So I urge you to consider using those things together. And once again, this article is, I think, a nice, happy article, but it also highlights some of these different kinds of supporting material that we were talking about. Okay, so you've got your sources. You've pulled out the supporting material that you need from the sources. Now, what exactly do you stick into your speech? How do you cite the sources? You found the stat you want, you found the quote you want, or whatever it might be. Now, what do you say? Well, this is something that we're going to reinforce over and over and over and over again this semester, and that is citing sources orally, in other words, citing sources out loud, using the method that we call ADT. ADT stands for author, date, and title. So author is who said it. Who said it, right? It's often a person's name, but it can sometimes be an organization. Sometimes we'll find a website that maybe doesn't have a specific individual that's attributed to that site. Instead, it will just have the organization's name, and that's fine. But there's got to be somebody who is backing the material that you found. We've said in earlier lectures that if you happen to find something, particularly online, and what you found does not have a person's name or an organization that supports it, that is willing to back it and be responsible for it and authenticate it, then it's not a good enough source. You should ignore it and go find a different source. So you've got to have an author, either a person or an organization. The D, of course, stands for date. Now we want the date that this was published, preferably, but especially again for those online articles, sometimes you can't exactly find when something was initially put on a website, for example. So if that's the case, then we just want you to cite the date that you found it, all right? And then lastly, the title. Now when it comes to title, you have a choice. You have a choice of saying either the title of the source or the title of the actual article. So in this case, with the article I was just going over with you, the title of the source is the Washington Post. The title of the article is Dog Adoptions and Sales Soar During the Pandemic. So I could say either one of these within my speech. Now lots of students opt for the shorter version, which is fine. But in any case, that's what I'm gonna choose from, one of those two things. So ADT, author, date, and title. So how would that sound? Well, let me use the article I just spoke from and give you an example. The Cabbage Patch craze of 1985, the Tickle Me Elmo mania of 1996. To understand what's been happening with the sales and adoptions of real-life puppies, we need to think back to other buying frenzies. This is according to Kim Cavan on August 12th, 2020, from her article in the Washington Post. Just like that. Now, the truth is you don't always have to say the author's first name. And you don't always have to say the date and the month of a source. So I could shorten it up Cavan 2020 Washington Post. But we definitely want to say the A and the D and the T. Let me give you another example. The monarch butterfly population is endangered, and this can be seen most clearly in its shrinking migration, according to Michael Wines, the author, science reporter for the New York Times, the title, on January 29, 2014, the date. And again, in this case, I've qualified it by explaining to you that he's the science reporter. So what we've gone over today is we've tried to explain to you exactly how you're going to pull out that important supporting material from your sources and then put it into your speeches. I know myself and your other teachers would be happy to help work with you if you're having a little trouble understanding this. But otherwise, I hope this is starting to make sense. If you'd like to watch this entire presentation with closed captioning, please visit the Communicate submenu on the UWW-TV website at uwwtv.org. Thank you and take care.